I'm right. I'm the director of CASI still. So welcome to the Research Center of the Central Asian Studies Institute. For those of you who come here for the first time or looking forward to the bottom why we do this research seminar, we will have some presentations and discussions by AUCA faculty member who had their research funded by the Central Asian Institute. For today, we have two speakers, Philipp Lottholz and Polina Manolova. They will present their research, or I don't know, they will discuss. The title of their presentation is No Escape from Ideology, a comparison of political and moral orientations in the former Soviet periphery. I think I will not improvise and present each of you separately and briefly. Instead, I will invite you to tell us something about who you are, what are you doing, and how did it happen that you are working on this topic. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming here. And we would like to thank CASI and Svetlana in particular for hosting us this university and helping us in us be on phone for the time we were here. So we are both PhD students in the University of Birmingham in the UK. I'm in my third final, I hope, year, and my research is on Bulgarian migration to the UK. And Philipp?
Yeah, I'm studying at the International Development Department in Birmingham, and my research is on state building in Central Asia, particularly Kyrgyzstan. So I have been here researching as CASI visiting scholar, mainly in South Kyrgyzstan with different organizations and institutions that are busy with peace building and social and community security projects.
Okay, so the structure of the plan for today's presentation. First, we'll start with a brief introduction, just for you to know how come we connect our two different research topics together in this presentation. Then I will present my individual data from Bulgaria, and Philipp will present his data on Kyrgyzstan. Then we are going to discuss trying to deconstruct the imaginary questions which we found really important in our data, and then we're trying to relate the workings of such imaginary ways with ideologies and try to consider what are the ideological effects of such an imaginary, and then we're going to conclude. So this presentation comes in line with global events like the Ukrainian crisis, the refugee crisis, where it was really demonstrated that such East-West ideological binaries are quite relevant today in the way people think about their place in the world and how they construct their worldviews and even their everyday lives. So we decided to inquire whether such narratives were also present in our own research, and we unsurprisingly found that yes, in the narratives of our informants, the imaginary West was really prominent. So in my case, in the Bulgarian case, this Western imaginary was really influencing people's decisions to migrate to the UK, and in Philipp's case, the Western imaginary was really evident in the process of state building and political reform in Kyrgyzstan. So our paper asks whether there can be an escape from such a dichotomized mapping of the world, and are there alternative ways of moral and political positioning. So yeah, now I give the floor to Philipp for explaining this interesting image that we decided to.
Yeah, a very interesting screenshot from the movie A Perfect Guide to Ideology, one movie in which Slavoj Žižek, a philosopher who might be known to some of you, analyzes different Hollywood movies and how we can see ideology in them. So this screenshot is one from the movie They Live, and the protagonist there discovers some glasses through which he can see the ideological messages in the real world. So he looks at different magazines, or he looks at different billboards, advertisements, and he just sees it like a blank sheet with one word on it, obey, or something like this. So it's sort of like X-ray glasses that help you to deconstruct the ideological content of anything around you. according to Zizek, the tragedy of our predicament is that when we think that we escape ideology into our dreams and we realize our dreams, at that point we are within ideology. So the idea being that basically we wanted to look at our research and at our respondents' perspectives and how they basically are sort of embedded or interpolated within ideology, probably not knowingly. So brief note on the methodology.
So my data is based on my 9, even more months of fieldwork in Bulgaria and the UK. So what I did participant observation and also interviews and just normal conversations with Bulgarians who would be migrants to the UK. And then I followed part of them on their journeys to the UK. And then also observed and talked with them about their perceptions of their new lives and disappointment that they experienced there.
And with my research, so I collected a lot of everyday conversations and sort of usual interactions and conversations with people, and added to that visual and discourse analysis, which was much more geared towards this paper. And generally my research was consisting of interviews, different focus groups and participant observations in different projects, more or less really relating to peace building and community security in Kyrgyzstan. And virtually in all of this sort of material, more or less the imaginary West, so the imagination that, well, there's a West and it is like this or it's like that, it was apparent there. So it helped me to sort of distill out this concept. So in this sense, our methodologies are not sort of completely consistent or even like the same, but we basically have a heuristic interpretive framework. We say, well, where do we see sort of imaginations of the West in our material, and we concentrate on what is there, and we don't sort of pretend to make like a scientific experiment where we have like the same methodology and try to make the same data. Okay, so we start.
Okay, so I'll go on with presenting my data in relation to this imaginary West, which I found so influential in my performance narratives. But before that, I'll give just a very brief background information on Bulgaria. For those of you who are not familiar, Bulgaria went through this 25 years now of transition towards market democracy, same as other post-Socialist, post-Soviet countries. So what was important about this transition was not just the drastic economic reforms like decentralization, deregulation, but also the fact that people had to leave out all familiarity of their lives and adopt new personhood, new models based on different moral underpinnings. So the public discourse throughout these 25 years of transition was contained in the phrase of catching up with Europe or reaching Europe. And this was the main the main goal on the political agenda, but also this was a shared national project. So the idea was that Bulgarians had to become very similar to their Western counterparts in terms of mentality, the values they shared, and also the standard of life. So the EU membership of Bulgaria was seen as completely as the milestone of that transitional process. It was given the symbolic importance of actually finally reaching to that destination and finally living the Western life that we all dreamed of. So the structural transformations, of course, like elsewhere, brought drastic social economic inequalities and problems like rising unemployment, increasing poverty, erosion of social welfare, sweeping corruption, and mass immigration waves. The dissatisfaction that people felt with the market reforms and with many aspects of Bulgaria's EU membership made them consider this transition not as a linear process anymore, but more as going into closed circles. So this dissatisfaction, however, surprisingly did not delegitimize this Western ideal, as the West still remained the telos for development. And actually contain the promise of fulfilling all the dreams and hopes that the post-socialist change never delivered to Bulgarians. So I would like to deconstruct this Western imaginary that my informants shared, and the picture I'm going to present here is much more simplified than the reality of my data, because of course this Western imaginary depended on the class background, the educational background, and the meanings that my informants confer to their migration projects. So I will present only the main views about the West. So for the majority of my informants, the West was considered, was related to the normality of life, so the West as normal life. Normal life was some ideal liberal democratic normality. The Western society was imagined as a very bureaucratic society with notions of rule of law, material plenty and success. But two main points which were really emphasized, made important in my informants' narratives were predictability and security of life. So predictability was understood as a smooth transition between different life phases. So attending school, then obtaining your education, finding a relevant job, creating a family, and then being able to ensure the same predictability of life cycle for your own children. The security was understood as a generous welfare that spread across all social groups in society, that was able to mitigate the risks and served as an insurance in case of hardship. The security was also rule of law and public order, and basically allowed people to plan their lives and to have some long-term goals, something which they found completely unable to do that in the current unstable climate in Bulgaria in which their lives developed. The economic aspects of the Western imaginary were related to ensuring a regular monthly income. So a lot of the people that I spoke to told me that the main reason why they're going to the UK was to be able to pay their bills and just to ensure their really basic, to meet their really basic expenditures, or basically to feed their families. And this is how they understood normal life, being able to pay your children. Another understanding of the West as success, wealth and recognition was shared mostly by the better educated, younger people in my sample coming from big cities. So their narratives basically represented that transition from a typical Bulgarian to this Western thinking European, and that was the narrative that was propagated in Bulgarian media messages and also in the new liberal political discourses in the country since the start of the market reforms. So the idols of this new generation were successful Western businessmen and politicians like Richard Branson, Margaret Thatcher, Steve Jobs. And here I would like to show one picture that I took from their Facebook profile. So this is apparently Steve Jobs in his early years, and it says, "There's no reason why you should follow your heart." So these were their idols. So this generation of young people saw themselves as really Western thinking, sharing Western values, really believing in the market economy, in capitalism, in equal opportunity. They were really success-driven and very determined to succeed in the West. They also always, I call them Westerners or Bulgarian Westerners, and they always constructed themselves in opposition to what they saw as the contrary normative model of identity, the one of the typical Bulgarian. So the typical Bulgarian was seen as lazy, backwards, focused on satisfying only their basic physical needs and being really culturally and spiritually impoverished. So these typical Bulgarians were not only scorned upon and ridiculed by the elitist minority of the Westerners, but they were also blamed for obstructing the Western transformation of Bulgaria. The Westerners who were really putting all their efforts into bringing real capitalism in Bulgaria as opposed to the wild capitalism that we now had, according to them, their effort was all rendered in vain by the Balkaners, or as I call them, the Balkaners or the typical Bulgarians. So here I have to say also that I don't believe that my informants were just naively believing this Western utopia, because I witnessed myself that when they arrived in the UK, they saw that the reality of their migration lives usually had nothing to do with their pre-migration imaginations related to the West. But they never openly voiced their dissatisfaction, and that was very interesting, and they always assumed some personal responsibility for not being able to achieve what they previously expected. So they will always tell me, oh, you know, yeah, I did some mistakes, I didn't do it the right way, but success will come, I'm sure, next time I do it, next time I go there, or I just need to stay a bit longer here, and I'm sure that things will work out for me. And here I want to give one citation which really captures this dissatisfaction, which is hinted at, but it's not openly expressed. So this is a quote from a 31-year-old girl who went to London, really well educated. So I read it. So what she told me after she arrived in London. Caught in the trap of our everyday existence, some of us patriotically choose to suffer in Bulgaria, while others play it brave and live for the West, presumably to ensure a better future for them and their families. And although the positivists claimed that the sun in any case will rise on our street and that somewhere else there is always someone who is in a worse state than ours, I cannot but feel the bitterness of the fact that our generations here and there, now and before, are totally cheated. And now very briefly about where this imaginary West was. Didn't have any actually physical, geographical existence. According to my informants, the West was situated in Western Europe, signified by Germany and England in general, and these countries, which were of course considered West because of the high standards that they offered, were also sometimes referred to as the white countries or the rich countries. So the more affluent the country was, the further west it was situated according to my informants. And of course for the young people, the West was mainly England because English is the predominant language taught in Bulgarian schools and most of the cultural messages they received in English. So they felt very familiar, very close to the West and the British culture and lifestyle. So now I would like to present the dark side of the West and some negative perceptions related to the West. And usually the Western image was really positive, but were there any negative characteristics of Western capitalism? They would always have to do with the Americanization of society. So America in that sense was not part of the West because America embodied everything that was negative about the Western capitalism. So America signifies moral decay, it was a negative side of modernity, low culture, limited thinking, stupidity. America was criticized for their expansionist, ruthless foreign policy, the spreading of American values and culture that were sweeping away traditional Bulgarian values, for example. So my informants would always tell me, oh, we all now live in America, right? And this would have very negative connotations. Also, Americanization was blamed for the commercialization of society, containing the phrase, it's all about money nowadays, isn't it? And here I have included one picture of Obama and again a picture that was shared by my informants, which reads something like the US killed the native Indians, enslaved the African Americans, dropped an atomic bomb over Japan, burned Vietnam with napalm, bombarded Serbia with uranium, and now suddenly they fell in love with Ukraine and Bulgaria, question mark. Also, these negative perceptions of the Americanization of the global society were also usually made with reference to Russia as Bulgaria's natural and historical ally. So these were references to Russia as an imperial power, an imperial force that is always behind our backs. And in case there is a crisis that happens in Bulgaria, it will always be Russia who will come and help us, not the EU and NATO. But this imaginary was really brought up only in relation to America, and it was not a sustainable, a vital imaginary in itself. Because the same people who saw Russia as our natural ally were also the people who went to the West. And alternative imaginaries, as I say, I don't think that there is any vital alternative center of hegemony despite the West for my informants. But here I present Bulgarian nationalism as a possible alternative, at least because it was discursively constructed as an alternative, but in reality did not offer any alternative way of existence. So Bulgarian nationalism was related to the glorious historical past of Bulgaria with some ethnic supremacy, abundant natural resources, and Bulgaria seen as the oldest European civilization. People claim that Bulgarians should become independent economic force and not rely on any Western or Eastern influences. So now it's Philipp to present his data.
Yeah, so So I will go through the Kyrgyz empirics, maybe a bit more quickly, because if you thought this presentation was theoretical so far, it will actually just get theoretical after the empirics, because we will sort of distill the theoretical essence out of them. So just really briefly on the Kyrgyz context, I think we see certain parallels with the Bulgarian transition after socialism. And I sort of thought, okay, why we call it difficult road despite democracy? So sort of the idea that, well, democracy was introduced in Kyrgyzstan and certain reforms were made, but even so, actually what many people within the population felt was the burden they had to shoulder to sort of successfully implement these reforms, rather than the dividend in terms of growth or wealth or whatever. So what we have is probably polarized and polarized sort of political field, two revolutions in 2005 and 10, also a sort of emergence of certain titular ethnic nationalist ideas, and generally sort of a state of life where sort of security and risk aversion has to be achieved through informal networks and through certain belongings or these kinds of things, rather than there being sort of the democracy, rule of law, and omnipresence and security that we're supposed to have in the West. And then further, there appears to be maybe a deepened peripheralization happening through the duration integration, even though, of course, as we also heard on Saturday, some people think that, well, maybe EU accession isn't that problematic after all, and the positive aspects might outweigh the negative ones. I would say it's quite apparent that also the negative aspects will have to be sort of shouldered by some people. So focusing on the sort of things that were similar in my data to what Polina found in hers, I would say that you mentioned the West in the narratives of Respondents from Kyrgyzstan can be seen as a sort of better elsewhere, sort of paraphrasing Alexei Yurchak's idea of the imaginary West of the elsewhere of the socialism. So a sort of elsewhere where if you would go there, then your life would just be better and would just be a bit easier than where we are now. So of course, me being German and being honest about that vis-a-vis many people in Kyrgyzstan, which is not always an advantage, many people sort of responded things like Germany, my dream, I would like to end up there, I would really like to go there, even though I go to Russia, I would rather go to Germany because you're just more secure there, you can feed your family and so on. Even though people didn't really know why they thought so, so if I push them on that point, they would say, well, it's like that there, isn't it? And I would say, well, not entirely, maybe, under certain conditions. And then, like, one step further would be those people who sort of say it's about civilization, and sort of Western civilization, or people in Germany generally are sort of more civilized. They produce BMWs very well, or other cars, so that's really great. And how can we achieve this order and this punctuality and all of this? How can we achieve it here? How can we do it here, where people are more simple or are uneducated? This sort of неграмотные люди, uneducated people, this is a very widely used term that I came across during my fieldwork. So the idea that, well, the West, things are just more orderly and better. And also sort of the comparison of different countries with the West. So for example, one respondent sort of comparing police reform progress in Ukraine with the one in Kyrgyzstan, and sort of saying, oh well, Ukraine is even so much further to the West in terms of reform than we are, so see how backward we are or how unable to make reforms we are. And just to give a more sort of insight into the empirical side, so many people had actually migrated to Eastern Europe, the US or Germany, or they had relatives living abroad, and they would still sort of espouse these imaginaries, although maybe I didn't push them as much as Polina did in terms of how they still maintain that imaginary, knowing that it's not all that easy actually over there in the West. And then also something that really sprung to my eye, and I'm still looking at how to incorporate it, is the sort of Western-oriented or Western-originated consumption in terms of Champions League mania or sort of, I don't know, World Cup, support and these sort of things. In terms of a sort of anti-Western sentiment, an anti-Western counter-hegemony, of course, what sprung to my eye was the sort of alignment with Russia and the sort of even either tacit or explicit, like pro-Russian sort of way of thinking about the world. And that also partly concurring with sort of great patriotic war, memorial culture and identification culture. So people would say things like when I introduced myself as who I am, they would say, well, you know that there was a war, and we fought with the Russians, and we were the Russians, and we killed we defeated the fascists and so on. And this was something that was really rubbed into my face often, or sometimes at least. So there's a strong alignment in that way. And then also this sort of identification of the West as something bad, based on the sort of American expansionism or also EU sort of expansionism, capitalism. So sort of military expansionism, but also, for example, the problem with Western capitalism that is very apparent now in the Greek crisis was sort of brought up by Respondents. And then the sort of idea that, well, after these democratic reforms and changes that were introduced, our country was on its knees, Nakamenia, and that you brought all of that to us, and we don't want that anymore. Right, so in terms of visual sort of material, there's a lot of sort of people wearing St. George ribbons, and I collected a few pictures where people sort of engage in this sort of, maybe memorial culture for themselves because they have relatives and so on, but also it appears to become something of a consumption or fancy thing. And as can be seen, it's for sure also Kyrgyz that engage in that, and not only ethnic Russians. So here we have different St. George's ribbons, and it's only the photos where they're visible best. That's our name is Cat, by the way. And then things like the sort of joking or unjoking suspicion vis-a-vis researchers, including myself. So people asking, oh, you're a guy who speaks good Russian, and you're here in some godforsaken place, maybe you work for the CIA or the FBI. So people would actually ask that on many occasions, and at some point I'm happy for any feedback as to experience of yourselves maybe. And then also like an identification of any foreigners as Americans. So either myself or Polina and I, on many occasions we would be asked, oh, are you Americans? Because you speak English, right? So there seems to be a sort of interpellation of people as subjects who perceive people who speak English and are apparently foreigners as Americans, and we didn't inquire what would be the implication of that, but it would appear that they are not solely positive. In terms of alternative positionings, so of course there's a lot of nationalism and reassertion of national interest, which sort of rejects both the Western and also Russian imperial interference. Can't go into too much detail, but I think we all know about some examples. Also like traditional knowledge and the sort of cultivation of traditional knowledge and its application for the preservation of Kyrgyz nation or for sustainable social development. Those are things that are quite current in the material. And sort of seeing neither the West nor Russia as major vantage points, which is limited because after all, people in terms of material practice, they will have to migrate to Russia in many cases because they think that's the only viable livelihood strategy. While some others say, well, who really wants to work will also find work in Kyrgyzstan, so it's possible to sort of adhere to your home country. So that's really like in a nutshell the empirics, and we'll now try to sort of synthesize those and give you some theoretical considerations.
Okay, so there are some points which we found relevant for both our research, some interpretations of the data. But first, one point I want to make specifically for my case. So I started thinking about this Western imaginary in terms of security and security of life and predictability as some form of socialist utopia that was actually projected in the West. And now the memory of socialism is actually reviving in Bulgaria, and there are novel ways of expressing that nostalgia, and I believe that this can be one novel way of expressing such nostalgia. And that is not to say that people want the socialist times to return or that they are nostalgic about all aspects of life. There is especially nostalgic for the security and the predictability of life that is now really lacking in Bulgaria. And also the fact that in Bulgaria you cannot really express openly such nostalgic feelings because of the demonization of both demonization of the socialist past, which happened in the last years. If you were to express such feelings publicly, you would immediately be seen as granting some ideological support for the past system. Some relative interpretations for both cases. From the post-Soviet periphery, it looks like the world is imagined again in these east-west binaries, ideological binaries. And it seems that developmentalist models are still very relevant. The idea that all backwards nations will start resembling and will approach the developed nations through a process of modernization. There were self-orientalization narratives and peripheralization narratives that our informants shared. And of course, there was dissatisfaction with this idea that, yes, the West will ever reach us. But the image of the West, as I said, still remained quite strong. And the idea nowadays was that, yeah, the West will never reach us, but we can reach the West. So migration came to be seen as the normalized social strategy for achieving this Western ideal. And also, of course, these static hegemonic binaries are a result of Western process of commodification and imperialism, where peripheral regions like Bulgaria or Kyrgyzstan are really enmeshed into believing that this Western form has some superiority. And these processes were also imaginary expansions done through media, for example, where the people from the periphery were mobilized into recognizing the West as this status for development. And some theoretical considerations now, of course, we can interpret this Western imaginary in different ways. In the theory, one way is to think about it as some symbolic matrix that confers meaning to people's ideas and their practices. This is based on Castoriadis and many others. So it's the imaginary is collectively structured, but it's also structured in the collective. It's important to say that such east-west binaries were also used not only to think about the global, but also to construct the local and to construct self-images. This is why class, at least in my case in Bulgaria, class was not thought about as based on some economic inequalities, but as some cultural denominator or normative denominator. So the society seemed to be divided between this elitist Westerner class and the mass of typical Bulgarians. And also regarding the post-socialist specificity of this Western image, we need to say that what Peshkopia calls the fetishization of capitalism, maybe this teleological perception of the future is still very prominent, but now people are not expecting some Marxist social modernity to reach their countries, but instead they have replaced it with capitalist ideal. And also another important point is that people tend to see the inequalities created by capitalism not as inherent to that mode of production, but they actually see it as a result of some Western or anti-Western influences. So actually people don't engage so much in political action because they cannot recognize this problem as structural problem of the system.
Yeah, and then in terms of how to basically make a connection between this discussion of what imaginaries are, how they are reproduced in practice, but also how they produce practice, Louis Althusser is very sort of helpful, and actually, yeah, I don't think the quotes are that helpful. I just say two things. So one thing he says is that basically individuals can be interpolated as subjects of ideology through discourse. So when they sort of reproduce a certain discourse, when they make a certain utterance, they can sort of subscribe to ideology by sort of drawing on certain registers. So they can sort of say, oh, the West is like this and that, see it positively, see it negatively, and by doing so they will be interpolated as subjects of ideology. And the second point that is sort of drawn out of Althusser's work is material practices. So even through material practices, people sort of subscribe to a certain ideology. So if I go to university, or if I go to school, if I go to a shop, those are very sort of mundane practices. But in this work on ideological state apparatuses, Althusser sort of shows how basically in that way you also sort of subscribe to a certain idea of how life should be. And then that was basically then our approach of saying, well, let's look at what people say and what they do and how they are thus interpolated in ideology. So just to wrap up very briefly, because we've already exceeded our time, in Bulgaria, the imaginary West appears to be the only meaningful center of attraction, so there isn't even like an East or like another alternative center that would sort of challenge this omnipresence of the West as the development goal. Whereas in Kyrgyzstan, I would say that just in terms of numbers, probably more people are aligned with Russia ideationally, more or less explicitly. But of course, the imaginary West is still espoused by many people, either very explicitly or sort of implicitly. And this group is probably maybe more influential if we look at it through a class lens, and can also sort of affect certain actions and practices. So in that sense, we can further say that the imaginary West is a gravitation center for migration and also still a benchmark for development, as I researched in Kyrgyzstan. And it sort of shapes these processes, but these processes also reproduce this imaginary West. So at the end of the day, can we say there's any escape from ideology? We would say hardly any, and we also don't pretend that we are not within some ideology, because we also go to our university and engage in the practices that we maybe don't like so much. But still there's the possibility of sort of academically inquiring it, putting on our ideology glasses, and sort of saying, well, which practices, which discourses are very naively sort of embedded in ideology, and how can we sort of counteract them. So yeah, here's the bibliography. Thank you a lot for the attention. We will be happy for many questions and input.
Okay, thank you, Polina. Thank you, Philipp. I'll open the floor for questions, comments, critiques. What else? Questions, comments, critics?
Agreement is also very good.
Thank you, congratulations on your very interesting research. And I would like to ask about your data collection. You did discourse analysis, like you used discourse analysis to analyze the interviews, in-depth interviews and focus groups, or you referred to political discourse or media discourse or other data also? And how you have chosen your participants, like from villages, from cities, and how did you reach them? How did you collected your data?
Yeah, mine was anthropological study, so it was fieldwork, long fieldwork, and relatively long, as much as I was allowed. And yeah, I haven't conducted any discourse analysis. It was just based on my observations, the conversations, mostly conversations, not really interviews, with the people that came to become my friends at the end, because I spent so much time with them, and I didn't have any really. I spoke to all sorts of people who wanted to migrate to the UK, so I didn't choose them based on their gender or age or class. So I spoke with all sorts of people, and yeah, Bulgarian migrants to the UK are really coming from all social backgrounds. So this is my data collection.
Yeah, and in my case, I would say that, yeah, so as we mentioned in the presentation, so I have the more mundane everyday interactions and conversations with maybe taxi drivers or shop vendors, and then I have those with people in NGOs working on peace building or like local crime prevention centers, for example. And so yeah, I just analyzed those texts basically. And then, I mean, in terms of like more political discourse analysis, what I found really interesting was looking at comments on Facebook on certain news media posts. I mean, as you might know, for example, when they posted about the AUCA campus opening, of course, people were, you know, really polarized as to what that means, why would you guys give money, and so on. So I mean, these things are very apparent, and it's not really like a big exercise of going into depth or saying, oh, we did that many, you know, that much material analyzed. It's more really heuristic and saying, well, what is there and how apparent is it?
Your different perspectives were affected not just by the different types of data and how you collected, but also your positionality as a researcher. So you being Bulgarian yourself, who has successfully migrated to the West and have achieved some recognition and success, and you being a German in Kyrgyzstan, and also you mentioned already in your talk how people were very explicit about, for example, the experience of the Second World War. But yeah, maybe you care to elaborate.
My position, of course, is a native. I don't know if it's advantage or disadvantage, because it can play out differently in different cases, in different moments. But yeah, of course, I think that I'm advantaged by the fact that I have experience in that country for a period of time, because I spent almost my whole life there. And I left only for my master's and PhD studies. But of course, I was seen as the Westerner and as the successful migrant from some of my informants who are in a worse position than myself. But I also always try to emphasize that I have went through the difficulties that they were going through at the moment, because that was the reality of my migration. So I was trying to relate along those lines with them. But of course, there was some animosity and real suspicion for my actual goals of this research. And similarly to Philipp, they believe that this is a research that was EU paid, or this was an European project that I was researching, and they were really skeptical, especially Bulgarians who were already in England but who were facing some real difficulties and hardship adapting to the environment. So they were really suspicious of me, and I really had to spend a lot of time trying to gain their trust.
Just to also briefly answer, so yes, of course, the question could be, in my personal interaction with people, wouldn't there be like maybe a positive bias, so they want to say how great they think Germany is, or how much they love it and so on. I should probably explicitly reflect on that if we write a paper. But of course, if you triangulate that with more sort of everyday or official political discourse, you find the sort of same tropes and myths that I encountered in my material there. So it's sort of a way of sort of confirming that. Plus, I sort of, when people would say these things, I would sometimes sort of take a oppositional stance and say, well, did you think all Westerners believe that? I don't believe it, and I'm actually quite critical. And within the West, these questions are very, very controversially discussed. And then they would say, oh, really? But I really thought so, And then they reset their concept, isn't it like that? So it's actually interesting how people really seem to sort of have these sort of basic positionings according to which they work, but there will probably be no room to push that.
My question perhaps is more related to the Kyrgyzstan case, because I sort of understand how from Bulgaria the world is really bipolar, right? Where you have West and Russia, right, on two sides of the on actually two opposite directions. While in Kyrgyzstan we also have it is sort of I kind of expected it to be much sort of more sort of multipolar, where we have China as a great influence, where we have Islamic worlds, and both are quite ideologically unique and have their own platforms, right, with a specific perspective on the West and on Russia. And so I was wondering if any of that multipolarity was reflected in the discourse, because the conclusions that you make about the dichotomy sort of does not address that aspect.
Just to reiterate, actually in Bulgaria the whole thing is that there is no bipolarity. It's like there's only,
what's surprising in the Bulgarian imaginary is that the Ottoman Empire and Turkey are completely absent if we trust you. Because I have heard Bulgarians who claim that the biggest misfortune for Bulgarians was that they were liberated from the Turkish yoke by the Russians.
Well, in the Bulgarian text, there was some bifurcation, but it wasn't the west or Russia, it was mostly the west or the Balkans or Bulgaria. So maybe this Balkans imaginary is where this Ottoman narratives are related to.
Yeah. And then in the Kyrgyz case, I mean, I also like encountered that, so that there's more to explore there, or like maybe question that. But just in terms of, you know, like my everyday interactions, maybe it was also that I sort of schooled people's utterances towards this sort of bipolar thing, and they would have told other things if I was a Turk or if I was from Abu Dhabi or something like that. So probably there should be some critical, explicit reflection on that there's other centers of, I don't know, global development. And that's, I think that's all I'll say. Yes.
Whether you also looked at the multi-ethnic nature of your respondents here, whether you asked, whether you noticed, and I'm not sure whether you're studying ethnicity per se, but did you find differences in depending on who your respondents were? And also you mentioned in your presentation this notion that you're starting to explore, which is that there also is an emergent alternative positionality, and there's a national positionality as the rejection of these dichotomies and polarities. Who does that emerge from? I mean, I'm presuming by national heritage you mean the Kyrgyz, but what about the ethnic minorities? And in what sense do you feel that emergent also from the Russians here, the Ukrainians here? I met my poultry guy told me insistently yesterday that he's a Kalmyk and that I should remember him as such, that he's not a Kyrgyz. So that ethnical question comes up, but what is then the positionality of minorities?
Aware of people's sort of ethnic belonging, and the sample is not very, very diverse. So it's probably again like a point to further explore. And so I could just, sort of confirm your expectations or anticipations that, well, they will probably not really subscribe to the whole nationalist alternative imaginary. Maybe they might, insofar as that is like a sort of modern nation one that includes all ethnicities, but I mean, I think we all know that this is sort of a tricky question, and it would probably, I mean, I would rather, remain with Marina and others who sort of criticize that and say, well, actually, nationalism in Kyrgyzstan is still a sort of creeping ethnic nationalism, and I purposely sort of didn't orient my PhD towards that because it's sort of a tough topic these days. So I sort of say, oh well, yeah, that's the situation there, and I don't think that I could add.
So when you're looking at Kyrgyzstan, you're looking at all citizens of Kyrgyzstan. So the identity is not necessarily the ethnicity of respondents. You're considering all Kyrgyz respondents.
Kyrgyz respondents, but considering that there might be a bias because, the people that I access will less likely be some ethnic minorities.
Well, unless they're Slavs, right? Unless you're clear to you that Slav instead of an ethnic Kyrgyz.
No, absolutely. I mean, it would, depend on the sort of scale of the study and how much it would be.
Fascinating.
You mentioned, Polina, briefly Orientalism, and I'm curious how that plays in here. If you're talking about a self-orientalizing factor, or if you're referring to an Orientalism that people are responding to from Russia, the Soviet model, or the West, and just what you mean by that.
So people will always compare themselves with the benchmark that is the West, and would always draw some negative conclusions of Bulgarians standing in the world, and also the way they kind of orientalize their fellow Bulgarians by giving them the label of all just typical average people who are not sharing these Western values that we are so adamantly fighting for. So I think it's mostly the self-orientalization, or as Todorova would put it, there is basically so Bulgarians, the European other, the dark European other, so yeah, it's in that sense. I'll try to bring both of your parts of the research together. So to Polina, I would like to suggest, maybe you have done this, because you said earlier that you didn't do a content analysis of media, but it might be an interesting thing to see how the predominant governmental media discourse has affected the way people perceive themselves, and probably to say to the audience, because we have 3 Bulgarians sitting in this room, the identity of and the differentiation between West European and Balkan is something that dates for over a century now in the discourse and the literature, and we still have not moved too far away from it. But I was wondering, and maybe also in the case of Kyrgyzstan, how the official narrative influences the way people think of themselves. I found in the case in Kyrgyzstan to be interesting that people would, if they could, they would prefer to live in Europe, but they go to Russia because this is where they have more opportunities, or think they have more opportunities, and maybe relate more to, because it's known. So maybe it's good to see under this perspective, and somehow as a continuation to this, in the case of the Bulgarian immigrants, I'm wondering why there is such a sharp distinction in the narrative, and in some way maybe the justification of those who immigrate in the West of Europe and those who immigrate in the States. I have not done research on this, but only looking into my Facebook feed, I can clearly see how the people who immigrated to America are much more critical to whatever happens in their countries of origin than the people who live in Europe. And I think that this identification of as Europeans is stronger to those who remain on the territory of Europe and than to those who immigrated further away. And to some extent, maybe a little contradiction, that not everyone imagines the West as the promised land, because we are doing research here. Yeah, of course. I'm really sure that not everyone imagines that, but my formats were people who are going to the West. So even if they didn't actively believe that, that was the narrative that they were constructing for themselves and also for me. So yeah, I suspect that they were biased in that respect. And also in regards to discourse analysis and the historical background of this imaginary, of course, it's there, and it's not really, it would be very interesting, but it's not really part of my research to exactly explore where this imaginary comes from, but of course it's contained in political media discourses, and also it's reproduced in migrants' narratives themselves, because when they come back to Bulgaria, they always emphasize the positive aspects of their experiences, and they're never really open, not really widely open to the public for their negative experiences. So this narrative is being reproduced for a really long time now, and it still remains quite strong, I found.
Yeah, and did you want to say something about people emigrating being more critical?
Well, I don't really have observations about people who migrate to America, but I agree with your comment, and I think it's really interesting that yeah, maybe they're more critical of what is happening in Bulgaria, whereas Bulgarians who go to the UK are really probably feel closer to home and not, in that sense, not that engaged.
Yeah, just in terms of Kyrgyzstan, like comparing like the people's sort of narratives versus the political sphere, I think like the whole spectrum is sort of covered, and of course you hear a lot of sort of patriotic, national interests, reasserting sort of talk within the political sphere, and then sort of Atambayev every once in a while playing the US bashing cards, against liberal or supposedly liberal media and so on. So I think that's quite apparent, and I think they are somehow mirroring each other. But what I found really remarkable, and I was told that maybe it's to do with there being a lot of like Russian television being broadcast in Kyrgyzstan, and many people just from Soviet times, so like the last Soviet generation, but even now the first post-Soviet generation being sort of embedded in this sort of world of Russia or Russian worldview, and thus sort of completely unconsciously sort of reproducing these things, and that might play a great role. So even if, let's say, in politics there's a more sort of national interest oriented and more sort of patriotic line, then there's still an importance to sort of be good friends with Russia, because there appears to be a lot of sort of such thinking within the population. But I'm happy to hear any contradicting sort of views if there are.
This comparison between Kyrgyzstan and Bulgaria can be very productive, because in some ways there are so many similarities, and it would be interesting to maybe further reflect why, given that the contexts are so different, there are so many similarities, yeah? So what sort of theoretical explanation, yeah, can we find to explain, though you put it or worded it differently? I think Polina was called it ethnic essentialism, and you worded it, Philipp, as traditional knowledge. So, well, why, yeah, these discourses of ethnic essentialism, basically, or national essentialism, appear as reaction to this, yeah, in different contexts. But my question: why actually we talk about imaginary West today? Because you mentioned Yurchak. So Yurchak in his book writes that that was a particular sort of aspect of the late socialism culture, when people in the Soviet Union imagined West, and it had in the framework that he constructs, it played a very specific role, where people invested their sort of dreams, and it had a special dimension. But it was also understandable because people didn't have access to the West, so they didn't have exposure, so they didn't know. So they had some sort of magic imagery of the West, which is sort of devoid of any routine and regularity. It is like a magic land, yeah, wonderland. But then, it has been already 25 years that people have access to the West, they encounter people, they watch television. They even mentioned Greece, for instance, so they are aware of the crisis, etc. But still, this imagery is so present and is so important, and it's indeed an interpellation. Are you Western or anti-Western? You're always positioned in this way, even by your research, because you make people also, you interpellate people as well to take some ideological bias in this respect. But so it's interesting why it came back. What is the driver of this West, imaginary West, despite that the situations in the late 1970s and today are so different, but the discourse is very much similar. And that's first. And second, this, when in some aspects the cases are very similar, but then you mentioned that socialist sort of past is discredited in Bulgaria, and so people may feel embarrassed talking about like being sentimental or nostalgic about their past, yeah. And then West becomes some sort of substitute of socialist utopia. While of course that's not the case in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, nobody is embarrassed talking about their nostalgic feelings about the Soviet past, and many actually invest their nostalgia into sort of Eurasian Union or sort of unity with Russia. So it's here the cases go sort of different directions, and it is interesting. Yeah. So I don't know what are the implications of this, but I think this is an important sort of divergence of these cases.
The one sort of pushing this Yurchak concept in all the time, even though these sort of things are also apparent in other literature apparently. But I think, you know, what we can learn from it, or why this is important, is that even though access is there, access is also very selective in terms of who can have it, and even if people access it, they maybe go with a certain view of the world. So this sort of imaginary West is now not produced in a world where the Soviet Union exists, but it doesn't exist anymore. But still, many other sort of factors and labels in which we map the world are still very valid. So yeah, we probably just wanted to sort of keep up that discussion in that sense, and sort of show how still space and the world is being mapped into east and west, but also into core and periphery. Yeah, I think that's one aspect.
And I can add that the only reason I'm talking about the West is because my informants were talking about the West. And they brought it up as something really important for them and influencing their decisions to migrate. But I don't think that this imaginary just reappeared now. But I think it was always there. It was probably suppressed in the first years when there was still some hope and some excitement about the changes that were going to come. But now people simply realize that nothing is happening here and we're not going anywhere. And the only solution is for us to go there. And here also, if we go into psychoanalysis, because it seems that they hold some explanation for this case. It's basically alleviating some inner anxiety that exists, and of course everyone needs to strive towards something. Everyone needs a dream to keep them going, so I think this is partly an explanation. So it's some form of self-deception. Of course, know that the West is not this promised land, but in a way they choose not to really engage very much into these negative images and negative stories that, of course, they hear. So yeah, it's a form of really self-deception.
Yeah.
And so, yes, right. And then how does your sort of interpretation and the discussion fits into this Occidentalist theories or perspectives?
Well, we presented a paper on a conference on Orientalism in the former Soviet periphery, and we sort of said, well, this sort of imaginary West and the ideology it contains, it sort of reproduces this Occidentalist sort of reification of the West and the sort of self-orientalization of people. So it's not being only about geography, but also about culture and about morality. So yeah, we sort of say, well, they all have like a common underlying thread in which we can see these things, but we shouldn't just dismiss things as merely geographic, but also be critical about the way in which people sort of, combine geographic origin and culture, then also with more like moral and political sort of hierarchization, sort of dominance hegemony.
And also this narratives work in the localities of people and their everyday lives, as I said. Social distinctions and polarization is also based on such dichotomies.
So it's basically like a critical instrument that could be used from an Orientalist/Occidentalist perspective in order to say, well, it's not only in those empirical cases that are, explored by these scholars, but you can also look at sort of this East-West and say, well, how do people maybe unknowingly reproduce this?
Okay. I think, let us thank Philipp and Polina again, and to meet you in 2 weeks' time.